Denzel Ward, a full 100 yards to glory.
One-handed grab, Mckissick. That is a sick catch. Down the middle, another one-handed grab from Gaskin.
Jefferson, you bet. Touchdown, Minnesota.
He's got it. 44-yard bomb to Tim Patrick.
Peoples-Jones with the touchdown. 60 yards.
Kane Wong-Woo is gone. 97 yards for the rookie.
He might take it all the way. Chubb to the end zone for the touchdown. 70 yards.
Caught! What a catch!
Welcome in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots podcast. I am Ricky Larson. Let's hop right in. This is the fantasy show. This is the show of all importance. We'll hop right into the Fantasy Kings from last week. At the quarterback position, we had Justin Herbert with 356 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 14 rushing yards, and a touchdown on the ground. He had 31.64 fantasy points. Good enough for quarterback one, to my delight. Have him in 3 leagues, so that was a huge win for me. Then the top running back. That was James Conner. He had 96 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 5 receptions for 77 yards and a touchdown. He was the top scorer of the entire league last week, and at the top running back position with 40.3 fantasy points. At the wide receiver position, this is kind of a shocker, but Elijah Moore, he had 8 targets, 7 receptions, 84 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Finally, a huge breakout game from him, and it came from an unlikely quarterback. We'll get to that when we get into those top quarterbacks. But Elijah Moore had 27.4 fantasy points to lead all wide receivers. And then at the tight end position, the Muth got loose. Pat Freiermuth got 6 targets, had 5 receptions for 43 yards and 2 touchdowns. That was good enough for 21.3 fantasy points. And if you watch the show at all, you know that Dylan Corbett, who we are going to have tomorrow, he's been on the Muth for the past few weeks. So hopefully last week he stayed on him because that was the top tight end. So now let's get into the top quarterbacks, the best of the rest from week 9. At the number 2 position for quarterback, you had Lamar Jackson with 266 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 120 yards on the ground, good enough for 30.64 fantasy points. Matt Ryan at number 3, kind of a shock there. He had 343 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 8 rushing yards, and a touchdown on the ground, good enough for 28.52 fantasy points. Now that shocker, when I was talking about Elijah Moore, the shocker at quarterback, it wasn't Mike White this week. He ended up getting hurt. It was Josh Johnson for the New York Jets. He had 317 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, an interception, and 18 rushing yards. Good enough for 24.48 fantasy points. And then in that same game, Carson Wentz, he has himself a top 5 game with 272 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 13 rushing yards, good enough for 24.18 fantasy points. The best of the rest running backs, you had Jonathan Taylor getting edged out. He had a huge Thursday night, but got edged out by 3 touchdowns out of James Conner. But Taylor was not a slouch this week at all. He had 172 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions for 28 yards, good enough for 34 fantasy points. Nick Chubb, he had himself a week. Absolutely incredible. Didn't see this much production coming out of him, but he had 137 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions for 26 yards, giving him 30.3 points on the week. Joe Mixon, in that same game, had 64 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 5 receptions for 46 yards, giving him 28 points. And then Nyheim Hines. You know, Jonathan Taylor at number 2. Nyheim Hines still got a lot of work, good enough to get into the top 5. He had 74 rushing yards, a touchdown, 4 receptions for 34 yards, giving him 20.8 fantasy points. Best of the rest wide receivers. Devonta Smith coming in at number 2. He had 6 targets for 5 receptions, 116 yards, and a touchdown. Good enough for 22.6 fantasy points. Barely getting edged out by Smith was Keenan Allen. He had 13 targets for 12 receptions and 104 yards, giving him 22.4 fantasy points. At the number 4 position, who? Olamide Zaccheaus had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 58 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's a pretty good ratio. 3 catches, 2 of them are touchdowns. That gave him 20.8 fantasy points. Then Marquis Brown. He had a bunch of targets as well, having 12 of those, 9 receptions, and 116 yards through the air, giving him 20.6 fantasy points. And then wrapping up the top players from last week, you got the best of the rest tight ends. George Kittle finally making his way back to being one of those top-tier tight ends. He had 8 targets for 6 receptions, 101 yards, and a touchdown, giving him 20.1 fantasy points. Just behind him was Travis Kelce with 8 targets, 5 receptions, 68 yards, and a touchdown, giving him 17.8 fantasy points. Darren Waller comes in at 4th with 11 targets, 7 receptions, and 92 yards, giving him 16.2. And then rounding out the top 5, the Muth got loose, while Cole Kmet also had himself a day. He got 8 targets, 6 receptions, 87 yards, giving him 14.7 fantasy points. So now before we hop into all of the players this next week, we got to look at who's going to be out this week due to bye. Not necessarily injury, we'll get into that a little later. But byes, period, you have David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert, and Darnell Mooney for the Bears. They'll be out this week. I guess if you're starting Justin Fields, he's also out. If you're starting Allen Robinson, he'll be gone as well. You got the Bengals. They got Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, C.J. Uzomah. All those weapons that you've been using, especially Jamar Chase, that's going to be a big hit to your fantasy lineups. They'll be out this week. They're on a bye, so you're going to have to find some way to pivot off of any of those guys. For the Giants, Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard, Devontae Booker, Evan Ingram, all those guys, if you're starting Danny Dimes at all, those guys are going to be out. And then for the Texans, you got Brandon Cooks. That's really the only fantasy relevant person on that team at all. So that should be an easy pivot away from him this week. All right, so let's hop into, what does the quarterback landscape look like this week? If you have Joe Burrow, who are you going to put in instead? Let's go ahead and start. We'll start with Lamar Jackson. He's projected 25.9 fantasy points going against Miami. I like the matchup. Miami isn't very good. Jackson has been, in every game pulling out tricks. If this game is either a blowout, it's going to be, he's going to have quite a few points to start out with. If it's close, he's going to close out the game with probably even more than if they are winning that game easily. So, I honestly think he's probably he's probably going to score a lot right out of the gate and give you a good fantasy week. For Miami, you got either Tua or Jacoby Brissett. Who knows? Tua could be back this week. If he is, he's projected 18.2. I don't trust him for this week at least. He's been doing all right, but going against Baltimore, I just don't see it, and he's banged up. So if he's not in, then you have Brissett. I also don't like that either for either one of those guys. Tennessee, you got Ryan Tannehill. He's projected 17.1 going up against New Orleans. New Orleans last week gave up a top 5 performance to the fantasy quarterback with Matt Ryan being up there. And Tennessee has had to kind of move towards throwing the football a little more, and A.J. Brown's a guy who's been going crazy. So Ryan Tannehill, I think in this matchup, you can definitely trust him, and I would lean more towards him than some of these other guys. For Buffalo, you got Josh Allen. He's still projected really high, 27.4, going against the Jets. So, again, last week, he was projected a lot. The Buffalo Bills were projected to beat Jacksonville by a lot. That didn't happen. Are we going to see, is this a slump for this team? Is Josh Allen going to, have another bad week against a team that is the upset team of the year? I don't think so. I think he's going to bounce back. And if the Jets game was any indication of how this game could go, and it's 75 total points, you're going to have to put in Josh Allen. Carson Wentz got himself up into the top 5 against the Jets. Well, Josh Allen's way better. This could possibly be a top quarterback week. He could be the fantasy king at quarterback next week if this matchup goes according to schedule or goes anywhere towards what the Indianapolis game did against the Jets. For the Jets, probably don't start either one of the quarterbacks or any of the quarterbacks, but, Mike White is questionable, projected 13 if he's going to be in. He had a really good performance his first time out. Josh Johnson, who replaced him last week, had a really good outing, a top 5 outing. But I would stay away from both of those guys. Buffalo's defense, even in the loss last week, didn't give up anything. So don't pivot to those guys. For Pittsburgh, you got Ben Roethlisberger, 16.9 fantasy points, going against Detroit. I see this more being a Najee Harris, lot of points scored game. Ben possibly, could get a few, but I don't see him going over 20 this week, just because it's Ben, and I have a feeling they're going to get up early on Detroit, and then it's just going to turn into the Najee Harris show. For Indianapolis, Carson Wentz, he's projected 18.3 and a top 5 performance last week. Sure, it was against the Jets, but this week it's against the Jags. I'm not going to take into consideration that Josh Allen didn't do well against the Jags. That was just a crazy coincidence of things just weirdly happening. In the NFL, the past 2 weeks has been awful for just weird shit. So I think Carson Wentz is a guy that you could possibly, if you have a quarterback that is hurt, if you do have Joe Burrow, Carson Wentz is a guy you could probably pivot to this week and comfortably play him. Now, would I play Wentz over Tannehill? Probably not. I just trust the weapons for Tannehill more than I trust Michael Pittman as a receiver for Carson Wentz. Tampa Bay, obviously you got Brady. He's projected 25.3. He's going against Washington. Enough said. Baker Mayfield against New England. He's projected 14.7. I would steer away from him. This is going to be a run-heavy game. But, New England could also make it a game, and Cleveland has to throw quite a bit. Matt Ryan against Dallas and Dak Prescott against Atlanta. Prescott, coming off of a weird week against the Broncos, and that was his first, week back or whatever, after, I can't remember what he was hurt with, but it was a little shaky. I think he shook off the rust last week. He's going against Atlanta. They gave up 25, I believe, to the Saints. So I think it's a bounce back week for Dallas and Prescott. And then Matt Ryan. If Teddy Bridgewater can go out there and have a decent game, Matt Ryan, he had a top 5 performance. So I think going against Dallas, he's also a guy you could stream for your quarterback position. Kyler Murray hopefully will be back for Arizona this week. He's projected 18.4 if he is. For Carolina, kind of interesting. You've got P.J. Walker coming in this week, and I said yesterday, I like P.J. Walker better for this offense and for Christian McCaffrey. I think those two can complement each other and make this offense look really good. Sam Darnold possibly is out this week, and if P.J. Walker gets the nod, he's somebody I would borderline put over Tannehill, definitely over Roethlisberger, possibly over Wentz. I think, there's a lot of chance for run opportunities, and if they're behind Arizona, they're going to have to throw quite a bit as well. So I think P.J. Walker could be a sneaky guy this week. Justin Herbert for the Chargers against Minnesota. I mean, it's going to be a game that at least 3 touchdowns are going to be scored. It's going to be a 3-point game for most of the time, possibly go to overtime. I think Herbert, he was the top quarterback last week. I think he's got a good chance to do it again in a game where they're going to have to score, 28, 35, 38 points to barely edge out the Minnesota Vikings. Kirk Cousins in this matchup? Maybe. I mean, again, same kind of argument for Herbert. I think Herbert has more upside. But you don't want to sleep on Cousins because those weapons can make things happen, and if they're playing catch up, Kirk Cousins is going to have to be involved. For Seattle, Russell Wilson should be back. He's projected 17.8. I don't necessarily like the matchup, though. It's still the Packers, and the Packers are just notorious this season for low-scoring games, so I'm not going to trust that Russell Wilson's going to go out and have a 25-point game. He could break 20, probably will, but to have one of those monster games, I just don't see that happening. And then on the other side of that ball, you got Aaron Rodgers projected 19.4 if he's back. I mean, I don't know. I also talked about yesterday, picking this game is conditional. Because the earliest Rodgers can come back is Saturday. Maybe he doesn't play this week, and if he doesn't, then Seattle, I think, walks away with that. Then to the Denver and Philly game, you got Bridgewater, you got Jalen Hurts. Hurts obviously has more of the upside with the rushing attack, but Denver did a good job last week against Dak, so is Hurts going to be one of those top 15 guys? I don't trust it. He's projected 19.5. But top 15? I just said no, but I think, top 15 might be pretty easy to get into. So we'll just have to see. Bridgewater, no. Just don't start Teddy Bridgewater, guys. Just don't do it. Patrick Mahomes and Derek Carr in that Sunday night game. I honestly like Derek Carr better in this matchup. There, I said it. I don't like Mahomes the past this whole season, but the last 2 weeks, it's been nothing. I'm not sure where he's ranked both those past 2 weeks, but last week he only had 166 passing yards. That's crazy numbers from Patrick Mahomes, and not crazy in a good way. Crazy in a good way has been Derek Carr this season, and going up against a Chiefs defense that's not very good, he's projected 18.7. I see him getting a lot more than that. I think Derek Carr possibly could be a top 5 guy for this upcoming week. Then you got Matt Stafford for the Rams, 21.3. Going against San Francisco, I like it. I just like this offense. They're also coming off of an off week where the offense didn't look very good, but Tennessee's defense looked great. So I think it's a bounce-back week from Stafford. Colt McCoy last week against San Francisco still had a decent game, and he is not the caliber of quarterback, obviously, that Matt Stafford is. So I think Stafford could have a good game. Moving on to the running backs, let's see. We got Myles Gaskin, projected 14.4 against Baltimore. Go ahead if you want. The running backs are kind of thin, this week you got quite a few out. So, say you're a Nick Chubb owner and he doesn't play this week and you don't have Ernest Johnson, Gaskin against Baltimore could get a lot of work. You got Kamara at 18.6. I mean, you got to play him every single week. And, the way the offense has to be now, it's got to go through Kamara. And, he's got the complement of Mark Ingram now, so possibly that's a pretty good tandem. Ingram's only projected 6.5. That makes sense. But Kamara, I think, can have a decent game against Tennessee, but we'll just have to see. Top 5, I don't think so, not this week. For the Bills, it's kind of interesting. Zach Moss went down last week. Should be in this week and is projected 13.6. But Devin Singletary got quite a bit of work in the last game. Had 7 receptions. Didn't make anything out of it, but still 7 receptions. If those go over to Zach Moss, I think he's the running back to start out of this matchup. If not, Singletary could be an interesting plug-and-play guy if you need it. But on the other side of that ball, you got Michael Carter, 14.5. Don't start him either. I know he's been kind of trending up, but Buffalo's defense is really good, so I just would not do it. For Detroit, you got Deandre Swift, projected 17.6. When I was talking about the Lions, this offense has to run through Deandre Swift. It has to run through TJ Hawkinson. So there's always a good possibility Deandre Swift is top 5. He's been top 5, I think, a couple times this year. So against Pittsburgh, there's a good chance of that happening. So go ahead and start him. James Robinson for Jacksonville, if he's back this coming week, you got to start him because he's the top playmaker for that offense. He's projected 15.2. But you're going to have to just keep an eye on him, make sure that he's good to go, and if not, you're going to have to pivot away from him. For Indy, Jonathan Taylor, definite top 5 guy. Had a huge week last week, just barely got edged out by 3 touchdowns. An incredible performance from James Conner. But Jonathan Taylor is making a really good case to be the best running back in the league with Derrick Henry out for the rest of the season. He's already been having, tremendous success. And if you've had him, you've been running your matchups in fantasy. So this week should be no different against Jacksonville. For Tampa Bay, Leonard Fournette is another guy who's really just taken over the role for his team, and going against Washington's awful defense, this is a game where Tampa Bay could get up and it could be the Leonard Fournette show. So I think you can start him with confidence in that running back 1 spot. For Washington, Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissick. This is a tough situation to deal with. Gibson, first of all, is hardly healthy, and even when he has been and has played, there's been a lot of times J.D. McKissick just gets a lot of the work. He's in on third downs, he's in on those 2-minute drills, getting a bunch of work while Gibson's sitting on the sideline. But on the contrary, Gibson gets a bulk of the work outside of those situations. So, out of these two, who would you start? I mean, honestly, don't start either one of them. It's Tampa Bay, but if you are in the predicament where it's either or, you got to play one of those guys, I would go McKissick for the simple fact of the receiving ability he has and the outlook of it being against Tampa Bay. Then for Cleveland, this one's going to be interesting. Nick Chubb has COVID. He's going to have to get 2 negative tests by the time Sunday rolls around, 24 hours apart. If he doesn't play, the only healthy running back in that room, the only one that can play, is Ernest Johnson. Somehow this morning, I picked up Ernest Johnson in a league. He was still sitting on waivers after waivers went through. So you can just add whoever after that. He was sitting there. I have Nick Chubb. So that was a huge situation that I did not foresee happening. That did happen. So either way this week, I'm starting a Cleveland running back. Whether it's Chubb or Ernest Johnson, I don't care, but either one is going to, I think, have a really, really big week. Then on the Patriots side of the ball in that game, who the hell do you start at running back? You have Ramondre Stevenson is projected 6.8. Brandon Bolden is projected 7.1. Damian Harris is projected 11.9. Don't start any of them. That's all I have to say. There's just, you don't know where the ball's going to go, and you don't want to start the wrong one. And it's already a tough matchup against Cleveland, so I know that's been kind of the bread and butter thus far for New England, but I would pivot away from all of those guys if at all possible. And again, if you're stuck, you just got to go with the old reliable of Damian Harris. I mean, he went out with a head injury last week. He should be fine, probably in concussion protocol, but should be back. And same with Ramondre Stevenson, which would leave Brandon Bolden really as that main guy. Just pivot away from all of them. For Atlanta, Cordarrelle Patterson, every single week, bails out my teams, at least at that one position. And this week shouldn't be any different against Dallas. He's just the utility man. He does everything, and you get to put him in at the running back spot. So, possible top 10 every single week. Then you have Ezekiel Elliott, projected 17.1. Again, should just be some sort of bounce back week for Dallas. I think their offense is fine. I think last week, it was just off. The Broncos got the win, but I think this offense should be fine this week, and Zeke should see, the normal workload and should be just fine. For Carolina, we had CMC return last week. He's projected 20.4 this week, so go right ahead, fire him up. Last week was kind of a slow week, and he still had 50 yards on the ground and 50 through the air, so he's only going to build on that. And, again, they're against Arizona, so they're going to have to be catching up in that game. And then for Arizona, this is a game where if they do get up, it could turn into the James Conner show. They don't have Chase Edmonds. It's likely he'll be out for a while with a high ankle sprain. And James Conner's honestly just outperformed him all year anyway. Conner leads the league in touchdowns and had 3 last week. I mean, he's kind of turning into the holy shit Cordarrelle Patterson player. And honestly, could even be better. He scores a lot of touchdowns. So with the extra workload of Edmonds being out, I think it's going to be a great week for James Conner. He could find himself back at that top spot next week for running backs. For Minnesota, you got Dalvin Cook. The Chargers' run defense is not very good. So, yeah, Dalvin Cook should have a game. Where is it going to come from? Are they going to be close and he's maybe going to get phased out of the game as they're throwing the ball? Or, or is it going to be close and they're going to be using him more? The Vikings are just a weird team to watch, a weird team to try to project, and Dalvin Cook really hasn't done a whole lot this year. He's had a couple of good games, but to continually give him a 19-point projection is kind of like giving Patrick Mahomes a constant mid-20 projection. So, Cook is still a great talent, but I don't know what, Minnesota's going to do and how this game's going to go. And that his performance is all going to depend on how that goes. Then for Seattle, you got possibly Chris Carson back this week. How much should you expect out of him? Well, it's Chris Carson. It's coming off injury, Chris Carson. So it's going to be Chris Carson starts, goes out for a decent amount of the game, and you're stuck with maybe 10 points. I would steer away from him this week at least. Let him show that he can get into the game, play the full game, not get hurt, and get you a decent amount of points. And, it's against Green Bay, so there's a good possibility he could get a decent workload if, the game stays close, but I don't trust him staying completely healthy throughout the game. Then you got Aaron Jones, 17.3, and A.J. Dillon also in that backfield. Jones, I like him this week. I like him every week. He's just a great talent. And A.J. Dillon, he's really kind of turned into, a really good second back that you can possibly flex. Or, if you're very weak at running back, you possibly can start him and hope for 10 to 12 points. Then for Philly, Jordan Howard has been the guy the past couple weeks. Touchdowns last week, touchdowns the week before. So you got to expect he's going to again be that guy with Miles Sanders still out. Going against Denver, they held Zeke to a, 15. So, if Howard can get close to 15, that would be a happy day for you. He's only projected 8.3, but there's always a chance of a touchdown. He's gotten a touchdown the last 2 weeks. That could easily bump that up to that 14, 15, 16 point range. For Denver, it's Melvin Gordon, Javonte Williams. Gordon's been the guy getting the touchdowns, but Javonte Williams just had 111 yards last week. He's obviously the better back, in my opinion. Sure, Gordon will get a touchdown, but that's really all he'll get. Everything else goes to Javonte Williams now. And Williams was one touchdown away last week from having a huge game, a 100-yard rushing performance, receptions, and a touchdown. For Kansas City, it's looking more and more this week like it's going to be Darrell Williams in that backfield against Vegas. Williams has been wishy-washy. 2 really good weeks. 2 weeks where you're like, where did he go? He was good last week. Where is he? So I'd stay away from him this week, honestly. Pivot more towards other guys. I'd be more confident starting Javonte Williams than Darrell Williams this week. I'd still start Williams over Gordon. I'd probably play McKissick over Williams this week. That's kind of a bold statement right there, but I think in McKissick's game, he's just going to get more opportunities than Williams and turn that into more points for you. For Vegas, you got Josh Jacobs. He's projected 16.2. It looks like he's right back on track to being a really good back. Kenyon Drake also in that backfield, projected 8.3. Drake's a guy you could probably flex. He's another one that gets a lot of receptions and has been able to turn those into decent, even running back 2 viable weeks some weeks. Then for the Rams, you got Darrell Henderson. I think that's going to be a good matchup for him. He's projected 15.3 against San Francisco. It's a possible top 10 week for him as well. And then for San Francisco, Elijah Mitchell, 13.7 projection. He's kind of been getting the job done. It's been very wishy-washy as well, with weeks where he's Elijah Missile and then other weeks where he's where to be found. And against the Rams, If you have Elijah Mitchell, you're probably playing him, but if you can pivot, I'd try to pivot. This doesn't look like a good week for him. Then we'll kind of breeze through the wide receivers. Marquis Brown, projected 16 against Miami. That connection's been real good this year. And Marquis is turning back into Hollywood. I think we can start calling him Hollywood Brown again. So I will start referring to him as Hollywood Brown. Don't need to talk about Saints receivers. Tennessee, A.J. Brown has, been a man the past few weeks. He's projected 16.2. I think, there's a chance he's going to get himself into the top 5 and make himself seen. Julio on the opposite side. If A.J. Brown's having a good game, I'm not going to trust Julio as having a good game. It hasn't worked out that way yet this year. So I would pivot away from Julio because I think it's going to be an A.J. Brown game. For Buffalo, again, just so many options back here. Stephon Diggs, 16.9. Hasn't been seeing all of the targets and receptions and all of that this year from Allen, but it's because he's got guys like Emmanuel Sanders behind him who, has multiple 2-touchdown games, multiple games with 5 targets or more. So Sanders, who's projected 12 this week, has as good a shot as Diggs to, go out and have a big week, as does Cole Beasley. Beasley's projected 13.2. He's starting to work himself back into the role he had last year where Diggs got a lot of targets, but Beasley also got a lot of targets because when they shift the focus over to Diggs, they just have Beasley out there standing all alone. So all 3 of these guys you can plug in and be confident in, but I think Sanders and Beasley, you need to restrict those to probably flex plays. For the Jets, I don't really want to talk about them, but Elijah Moore had that big week last week, so there's a possibility. I mean, it's against Buffalo, but if he's going to be the main target, and if they do score touchdowns, he had 2 last week, so that's who I'm going to have to go with for the Jets. For Pittsburgh, Deandre Johnson against Detroit. So, I'm not super confident in Ben getting a lot of points, but if they're going to get up early and, often, Johnson's going to, be that guy that gets a lot of targets. Touchdowns? I don't know. Those probably go to Chase Claypool, but Johnson is just a target hog. So, you could expect to maybe even see 8 to 10 targets to Johnson this week. For Indy, Michael Pittman Jr. is just showing up, punching in, playing a huge game, and punching out. He's doing fantastic things so far. The past few weeks have been really good for him, and with Carson Wentz actually playing well, that benefits Michael Pittman a lot. Pittman, he's a wide receiver 2 play, but he's got top 15 potential for the week. For Tampa Bay, you just start all of these receivers and hope the one you put in is the one that hit. Evans projected 16.4. He had the 3 touchdowns a couple weeks ago, so we know he's always that kind of threat. Chris Godwin is projected 16.2. And then coming back hopefully this week, there was reports a couple days ago that he was still in a walking boot, but Antonio Brown is projected 15 if he plays. So again, it just depends. You got to play all of them and hope yours is the one who hits. For Washington, Terry McLaurin, there should be no doubt you're going to start him. Tampa Bay's passing defense isn't very good, and if they are getting up on Washington's going to have to throw, and who are they going to throw to but Terry McLaurin? I think it could be a huge week. He could have anywhere from 12 to 15 targets. I don't think that's even close to out of the question. For Cleveland, Landry is projected the highest at 13, but the guy that I would probably take the gamble on if I'm going to put in a Cleveland wide receiver would be Donovan Peoples-Jones. 2 weeks, 2 huge plays. Baker just likes going to him for those big chunk plays, so I would bet on Peoples-Jones, who's only projected 9 points, but has scored 20 in the past 2 weeks. 20 in each of the last 2 weeks. For Atlanta, who do you start there? Russell Gage. He's projected the highest at 10. Taraji Sharp, I believe that's how you say his name, projected 8.8. Olamide Zacchaeus, who was, touchdown Zacchaeus last week, is only projected 5.5, but I wouldn't dabble in any of them, if we're being totally honest. For the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb, 15.1. Again, I think it's going to be a bounce back for that team. So himself and Amari Cooper. Cooper could be questionable, but he's projected 14.4. I think both these receivers have a really good chance of both breaking the top 15. It's a good matchup to do it, and if Atlanta can keep it close, it's going to be a shootout, which always favors both of those receivers. Arizona, if D-Hop does play, projected 13.3, but it's still not, for sure. And if he doesn't play, Christian Kirk was the guy last week. Kirk this week is projected 9.2. I imagine if D-Hop does officially get ruled out, that Kirk, his projection is going to go up, as I would expect, him to maybe get even 13 to 15, which in some leagues could be that flex player for you. For Minnesota, Justerson. Yeah, Justerson, the guy who plays for Minnesota. No, Justin Jefferson, he's projected 15.8. Thielen is projected 14.5. I like Jefferson, obviously, as the higher of the two receivers. He had that giant touchdown catch last week, which helped out a lot of fantasy managers. And had it not been for a late touchdown to Thielen, then Thielen would not have had a relevant fantasy week. That touchdown really bailed out a lot of people who started him. For the Chargers, Keenan Allen, coming off his best game of the year, 13 targets. I would like to see things spread out more, and not in the terms of Anderson and Parham getting touchdown targets. Like, that's ridiculous. If you're going to throw a tight end touchdown target, it better be Jared Cook. If not, throw the damn ball to Mike Williams. Like, he was your touchdown guy to start the year, and you just haven't looked his way. Williams had one huge catch last week, but that was it. He's projected 15 this week. I would start Allen in a higher regard than Mike Williams. Allen's projected 16.5, but this offense can definitely spread the ball, spread the field, and I'm just hoping both of those receivers can be viable this week in a game against Minnesota where there's a chance they have to score upwards of 28 to 31 points. For Seattle, DK Metcalf is projected 16.2. Tyler Lockett is projected 14.8. Metcalf, he's just an absolute freak of nature, and he's come onto his own before Wilson got hurt. And, a couple weeks ago, which killed me in fantasy, he had one big catch and that was it. Hopefully with Wilson being back, he gets more targets. The offense is running smoother. But, maybe this week is a resurgence for Tyler Lockett, who had those big games the first couple weeks. 14.8 this week. With Wilson back, I think that there's definitely a chance that Lockett possibly could go off again. For Green Bay, Devontae Adams, no question about him. He's projected 21.2. That's all I got to say about it. He's going to be in the top 5. It's a game against Seattle. Well, I'm not going to say top 5 because just the way the Packers have been playing with Rodgers, it's not anything I really want to get in too deep on. So top 10 probably is viable for that. For Philly, Devonta Smith got all of the targets last week, all of the receiving yards. 116 of Hurts's 180 went to Devonta Smith, so obviously he's got to be that main receiving target. And, you know, I wouldn't put him as one of your starters, but maybe a flex. He's projected 11.6, so I guess we can see. But Denver's defense did a great job last week. They've done a decent job against other receivers throughout the year, so Smith I'd be a little hesitant on. Then for Denver, this is another toss-up. You just don't know who's going to be the guy. Tim Patrick last week. This week he's projected 8.1, but last week had the big touchdown catch. And I think 4 catches other than that. So you thought maybe with Jeudy coming back, Tim Patrick wouldn't have those opportunities, and he still did. Jerry Jeudy was the more involved target-wise, and he's projected 12.9 this week. So, you know, that was a slow week, comeback, get reacclimated type of game for Jeudy. So this week, could we see him open up more, or is it going to continue to just be a toss-up between any of these receivers? Because you also have Cortland Sutton projected 12.2, who really just hasn't showed up at all this year. He's had a few good games, a few games that are mediocre, decent, but fantasy-wise, he really hasn't helped you at all this year. So, you know, if I was to go for either one of these or any of these receivers, I think I'd have to go Jeudy, then Patrick, and then Sutton if I had the choice. Kansas City, Tyreek Hill, 19.7 is his projection. You know, coming off a couple weeks ago where he had 18 targets. Last week had a healthy amount of targets. You know, there's always that possibility he's in the top 5. And it's against the Raiders. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, you're playing him. 100% you're playing him. I don't know what I'm talking about right now. You're just playing him. But the expectation of where he's going to finish, you know, you hope for that 19 to 20 points, even more. But this Kansas City offense is just weird. So who knows? For Vegas, they got a little interesting. You know, Hunter Renfrow last week had the same amount of targets, same amount of yards, which are good. Those are good numbers. He's projected 13.1, but the interesting story is, you know, Desean Jackson is now on the Raiders. So what kind of impact is he going to have? He's only projected 6.7, but who knows? I think Renfro's got to be that top receiving target. I'm actually even considering flexing Hunter Renfrow this week over somebody like Mike Williams. I don't know what Mike Williams is going to do, but I know that Hunter Renfrow is going to get his 7 targets, and, you know, let's see if that turns into a touchdown with more opportunity. Then for the Rams, Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, both those guys projected pretty well. Cooper Kupp at 24 points, Robert Woods 15.2 against San Francisco. Yeah, I think these guys are going to light up the scoreboard for your team. Then Debo, he should be more healthy this coming week. So, you know, you should expect to see what you've seen from him all season. Hopefully he gets into the end zone. I'm really tired of Debo getting all these yards and no touchdowns. He's on 2 of my teams, so A touchdown would be great, but even if not, he can still produce without touchdowns. And then we'll breeze through the tight ends. George Kittle, possibility he has a good game. He had a really good welcome back game last week. He's projected 14, so you can be comfortable starting him. Darren Waller, of course you can be comfortable starting him. 15.3 is his projection, going against a lackluster against the pass defense of the Kansas City Chiefs. Dallas Goedert, he's one that maybe you can start him, maybe not. I am really stuck right now between either Goddard, Jared Cook, or Dalton Schultz. So, I guess I can kind of try to make a decision right now so that if you guys are in that same position, you can think about it. I'd probably go Schultz just for the fact there's a consistent amount of targets going his way every week. Goddard, you don't know, and with everything you saw last week from the Eagles, where everything went to Devonta Smith, I don't want to try to even mess with that. And Jared Cook, there's two other guys at tight end that apparently catch touchdowns too, so I wouldn't trust him as much. Mark Andrews against Miami, 100%. I think he gets a touchdown. He's projected 13.7. I could see Andrews getting top 5 next week for top tight ends. All right, let's see. Who else? The Muth. Do we think the Muth gets loose again and gets back into that top 5? I don't know. Pat Freiermuth is projected 9.6. He just got a good workload last week. He's been getting a good workload the past few weeks. So he's somebody that, say you had, who's on bye again? I already have forgotten that information. If you possibly had Uzama, if you had Ingram, I definitely think you just take the flyer on Pat Freiermuth yet again this week, and it could pay off. Kyle Pitts, projected 14.8 against Dallas. Dallas isn't necessarily really all that great against tight ends, and with Kyle Pitts being the top receiving target, obviously he's going to pull a lot of attention, but he's still a freak athlete and still their top guy, still going to get the targets. So I think he as well could have a big week, projected 14.8. Man, yeah, that's probably it for tight ends. I mean, there's honestly not a whole lot to get excited about there. You've got those few guys, and we'll just have to see who's going to be the who of Whoville this week from the tight end position. So we'll wrap it up with who are going to be our top quarterbacks this week. I think at the top quarterback spot, you're going to see Tom Brady. He's projected 25.3, going against Washington, who is 32nd against the pass. They give up an average of 298 through the air, 2.5 touchdowns, and 28 points to quarterbacks per week. And they've given up 4 30-point performances. So there's a fantastic chance that he is going to be that top guy this week. Then you have Lamar Jackson. I think he's going to be the number 2 guy this week, 25.9, so he's projected a little higher, and he's against Miami, but Miami, they give up a little less. They're 30th against the pass, 296 through the air. They give up 15 rushing yards per game, but obviously it's Lamar Jackson. He's probably going to go out and have 100, which could put him over Tom Brady this week. But they also give up 2 touchdowns, but only 22 points per game to quarterbacks. And they've only given up 1 30-point game, and they've given up 1 40-point game. So I just like the possibility for Brady to have a bigger week. He, I think, can go out and pass for 5 touchdowns, as where Lamar, I can see 250 through the air and 100 on the ground, but only maybe 2 touchdowns. For your running back position, I think Jonathan Taylor doesn't get edged out this week. I think he sits back on top of the fantasy kings for running backs next week. He's projected 18.8 going against Jacksonville. Jacksonville gives up 80 rushing yards, 33 receiving yards, and a touchdown per week, averaging out to about 17 points per week to running backs. They've given up 2 30-point performances and 1 20-point performance. And just recency bias of the way Jonathan Taylor's been playing. Go for it. I mean, he's going to be that top guy because he's just been tearing up defenses left and right. And then I think Najee Harris is going to go ahead and be that number 2 running back next week. He's projected a whopping 22.4. He's projected, I think, the highest of all running backs this week going against Detroit. Detroit gives up over 100 yards rushing per game, 34 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, and 25 points per game to the running back position. They've given up 4 30-point performances and 2 20-point performances. There's a chance he edges out Jonathan Taylor, but Jonathan Taylor, I think he's going to be the guy this week. For your wide receivers, I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm not going to put Cooper Kupp up here. There's a good chance Cooper Kupp could be in the top 2, but I don't want to just go with the obvious, choose the highest projection guy. So, for the number 1 receiver, I'm going to go with Keenan Allen. He's projected 16.5 going against Minnesota. I've already kind of talked about how this game, I think, both teams are going to have to score a lot of points to be able to beat each other. And Minnesota gives up 187 yards and a touchdown per week to receivers. They also give up 13 receptions and 25 points per game. Here's some stats, though, that really get me fired up for Keenan Allen this week, besides his 12 targets last week. Minnesota is giving up 6 games with 20 points, 2 games with 40 points, and Allen has 4 games with 19-plus points this season. He's been very quiet, a quiet assassin, but he is still performing really well, and he's got a huge chance this week against Minnesota to also play extremely well. And then for your number 2 wide receiver, I think you're going to have to go with Marquis Brown. He's projected 16 points going against Miami. Miami gives up 192 yards, a touchdown, 15 receptions, and 27 fantasy points. They also give up 6 games of 20-plus points, but they've given up a 50-point game. And Brown has 6 games, which is 2 more than Keenan Allen, of 19-plus. So is there a chance we could see Marquis Brown at the tippy top? Yes. But I just think that, he's got more to worry about from Lamar just running the ball than Keenan has of Herbert just running the ball. But I think those are going to be your 2 top guys at the wide receiver position. And then tight end, I mean, I got to go with the cop-outs. Travis Kelce, projected 16.3 going against the Raiders, who give up 7 receptions, 58 yards, and a touchdown for 10 points per game to tight ends. They've given up a 20-point game, and they've given up a 10-point game. And it's Travis Kelce, regardless of how bad the Chiefs are or have been or are doing. Kelce's still out there inside the top 5 for your tight ends every single week. And then Kyle Pitts, I think, is going to be that number 2 guy. Projected 14.8 against Dallas. Given up 5 receptions, 58 yards, and a touchdown for 8 points. And they've given up one 20-point game and one 15-point game. So I think those are going to be your top 2 tight ends. I think those are going to be all of your top players from the next week. So hopefully, good luck in the matchups this week. Let's hope the NFL levels out so that our fantasy teams can level out, because guys who should be scoring you a lot of points probably the past couple weeks has not. So let's hope that gets better for all of us. Go ahead and join us tomorrow. Dylan Corbett is going to join us. We are going to have all of the betting analysis. We're going to look at I'm going to put together my own parlay, see how what he thinks of that. We're going to put together, lines, strategies for who we're going to place bets on this week to kind of help you place your own bets if you would like. But that is it for today's fantasy show. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you here tomorrow.